The story unfolds in 1387 during the twilight of the Bulgarian Empire, when King Bojan IV ruled from his crumbling palace in Sofia. A man whose love would descend into an obsession so profound it would shake the foundations of both church and crown. The fever took Queen Elitsa on a Tuesday morning when the autumn leaves had begun their descent into death, their golden corpses carpeting the palace courtyards like scattered coins from a beggar's purse. King Bojan IV watched his beloved's final breath escape her lips with the soft sound of silk tearing. And in that moment, something fundamental ruptured within the architecture of his soul. The physicians retreated like shadows, their useless remedies clutched in trembling hands, leaving the king alone with the cooling flesh that had once been the axis around which his world revolved. For 3 days and 3 nights, Bojan refused to release her body to the grave. He held Elitsa against his chest, her head nestled in the hollow of his shoulder, where it had rested during countless nights of living warmth. The courtiers whispered beyond the locked doors of the royal chamber, their voices carrying the weight of scandal and concern. They spoke of madness, of grief that had curdled into something unrecognizable, of a king who had forgotten the boundary between the living and the dead. But Bojan heard only the terrible silence where Elitsa's heartbeat should have been, a rhythm that had once synchronized with his own breath, his own pulse, his own desperate need to exist within the sphere of her love. The queen's skin began to change on the second day, taking on the waxy pallor of church candles, her lips darkening to the color of wine dregs. Still Bojan held her, whispering endearments into hair that no longer held the scent of rose oil and morning dew. He traced the familiar geography of her face with fingers that had memorized every curve, every shadow, every imperfection that had made her beautiful beyond the comprehension of poets. The servants who dared to enter found him speaking to her as if she could hear, as if death were merely a temporary inconvenience that love could overcome through sheer force of will. On the third night, as the palace settled into an uneasy quiet broken only by the scratch of rats in the walls and the distant tolling of church bells, Bojan made a decision that would condemn his soul and elevate his legend. He would not surrender Elitsa to the earth's hungry embrace. If God had stolen her breath, he would steal her back from God. The king summoned his most trusted advisors, men whose loyalty had been purchased with gold and sealed with fear, and gave orders that would make them accomplices in what the church would later call the most heinous blasphemy in Christian memory. The transformation began at dawn, when the palace corridors still held the blue-gray light of early morning and the world seemed suspended between dream and waking. Bojan had sent for the court physician, a skeletal man named Dimitri, whose knowledge of anatomy had been gleaned from years of battlefield surgery and whose conscience had been gradually eroded by proximity to power. Together with a Moorish alchemist whose presence in the Christian court was tolerated only because of his usefulness, they began the delicate work of preserving what death sought to claim. The process was both scientific and ritualistic, combining the ancient Egyptian arts of mummification with medieval alchemy, and the desperate improvisation of a man who refused to accept the finality of loss. They removed her heart with surgical precision, the organ that had once beaten in rhythm with Bojan's own, and filled the cavity with aromatic herbs and precious spices imported from the furthest reaches of the known world. Frankincense and myrrh, cinnamon and cloves, rosemary for remembrance and sage for eternal love. Each ingredient chosen not merely for its preservative properties, but for its symbolic significance in the theology of their impossible undertaking. Her blood was drained and replaced with a mixture of wine and honey, the wine representing the blood of Christ, and the honey symbolizing the sweetness of love that transcends mortality. Her skin was treated with oils and unguents, massaged back to a semblance of suppleness by hands that had once caressed her in passion and now touched her in the service of an obsession that bordered on the divine. The alchemist worked with the focused intensity of a man creating not merely a preserved corpse, but a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Boyan supervised every aspect of the process, his eyes never leaving Elitsa's face, even as the most intimate violations were performed upon her body. He spoke to her throughout the procedure, his voice a constant stream of apologies and endearments, promises and prayers directed toward ears that could no longer hear, but which he believed might still understand. When the work was complete, when her body had been transformed into something that defied both nature and divine law, she appeared to sleep rather than rest in death, her skin pale but unmarked by decay, her features composed in an expression of peaceful repose that made her seem merely momentarily absent rather than eternally departed. The king ordered his seamstresses to create a wardrobe for his preserved queen, gowns of silk and brocade in the colors she had favored in life: deep burgundy, forest green, midnight blue adorned with threads of gold that caught the candlelight and made her seem to shimmer with an inner radiance. Her hair was arranged daily by a trembling maidservant who had been sworn to secrecy under penalty of death, styled in the elaborate braids and coils that had once been the envy of every noblewoman in the kingdom. Cosmetics were applied to maintain the illusion of life: rouge for her cheeks, kohl for her eyes, carmine for her lips that Boyan kissed each morning and each night with a devotion that had transcended the boundary between worship and madness. The royal bedchamber became a shrine to impossible love, its walls draped in black velvet that absorbed light and sound, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight where the normal rules of existence seemed suspended. Candles burned constantly, their flames dancing in the drafts that seeped through the ancient stones, casting shifting shadows that made Elitsa appear to move, to breathe, to exist in some liminal space between life and death. Boyan would spend hours simply watching her, studying the familiar contours of her face for signs of the animation he desperately wished to see, interpreting every flicker of candlelight across her features as evidence that some spark of consciousness remained trapped within her preserved flesh. At night, he would lie beside her on their marriage bed, his arm draped across her waist, his face buried in hair that still held the artificial scent of the oils used in her preservation. He would whisper the secrets of his kingdom into her unhearing ears, share his fears and doubts and dreams, as if she could still offer the counsel that had once guided his decisions. The courtiers who were forced to attend him during these nocturnal audiences learned to keep their eyes averted, to speak only when spoken to pretend that the woman who lay beside their king was merely sleeping, rather than existing in a state that violated every natural and spiritual law they had been taught to respect. The routine became as rigid as any religious observance, a liturgy of denial performed with the precision of the most devoted monk. Each morning, Boyan would greet Elitsa with a kiss, his lips pressing against flesh that yielded but did not warm, that received his affection but could not return it. He would speak to her of the day ahead, of the matters of state that required his attention, of his plans for their kingdom's future. Always their kingdom, never his alone, as if she remained his co-ruler even in death. The maidservants would then perform their daily ritual of grooming and dressing the queen's body, handling her with a mixture of reverence and terror, knowing that their lives depended upon maintaining the illusion of her continued existence. The deception might have continued indefinitely, sustained by the absolute power of a king whose word was law, and whose madness had infected his entire court with a shared delusion. But secrets have a way of seeping through stone walls and locked doors, of finding voice in the whispered conversations of servants and the troubled dreams of those who witnessed horrors they could not comprehend. The truth began to spread beyond the palace walls like a contagion, carried by traders and travelers, by priests and pilgrims, by anyone who had glimpsed the impossible reality of Sofia's cursed court. Brother Methodius, a Dominican monk whose piety was matched only by his political ambition, first brought word of the king's blasphemy to the attention of the church hierarchy. His letter to the Patriarch of Constantinople read like a catalogue of abominations, each detail more horrifying than the last, each accusation carrying the weight of eyewitness testimony and moral outrage. The king, he wrote, had defied God's will by refusing to surrender his wife to Christian burial. He had mutilated her sacred body, violated the temple of her soul, and transformed her into an idol of pagan worship that mocked the very foundations of Christian doctrine. The response from Constantinople was swift and merciless. A papal bull was issued declaring King Boyan IV excommunicated, his kingdom placed under interdict, his subjects released from their oaths of loyalty. More than mere political maneuvering, this was a declaration of holy war against a ruler who had crossed lines that could not be uncrossed, who had committed sins that could not be forgiven. The Patriarch dispatched a company of Templar knights, men whose faith had been hardened in the crucible of the Crusades and whose devotion to God's law superseded any loyalty to earthly monarchs. The siege began on a morning when winter's grip had tightened around Sofia like a fist, when the palace stones seemed to exhale cold, and the very air carried the promise of death. The Templars surrounded the royal compound with the methodical precision of men who had learned their craft in the Holy Land. Their white mantles marked with red crosses that seemed to burn against the grey sky like drops of divine blood. They came not as conquerors seeking treasure or territory, but as instruments of God's wrath, holy warriors whose mission was to cleanse the world of an abomination that threatened the very order of creation. Boyan received word of their approach while he sat beside Elitza's preserved form, his hand resting on her still chest where no heartbeat would ever sound again. The messenger who brought news of the encirclement trembled as he spoke, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to deliver information that might already be obsolete. The king listened with the detached calm of a man who had already surrendered his soul to forces beyond his control, his eyes never leaving his wife's peaceful face as reports of armed knights and siege engines filtered through his consciousness like background noise. The Templars' ultimatum was delivered by their commander, a scarred veteran of Jerusalem whose voice carried the authority of divine mandate. They demanded the immediate surrender of the Queen's body for proper Christian burial, the king's public repentance for his sins against God and nature, and his submission to the Church's judgment for crimes that transcended the temporal realm. In return, they offered him the possibility of redemption, the chance to save his immortal soul through sincere contrition and acceptance of whatever penance the Church deemed appropriate. Boyan's response was delivered not through words, but through action. He ordered his remaining loyal guards to bar the palace gates and prepare for siege, though both king and soldiers knew that their position was ultimately hopeless. The royal armory contained enough weapons and provisions for perhaps a week's resistance, while the Templars could afford to wait for months if necessary. But for Boyan, the mathematics of warfare had become irrelevant. He was no longer fighting for victory or survival, but for the right to spend his final hours in the company of the woman who had given meaning to his existence. The assault began at dawn 3 days later, when the morning light struggled through clouds heavy with the promise of snow, and the air rang with the clash of steel on steel, the splintering of wood, the screams of dying men. The Templars advanced with the inexorable patience of divine judgment, their shields locked in perfect formation, their faith serving as armor against the desperate resistance of Boyan's outnumbered forces. They had come not merely to capture a heretical king, but to purify a place that had been corrupted by acts too heinous for Christian tolerance. As the palace walls were breached and the sound of fighting drew closer to the royal chambers, Boyan made his final preparations with the careful attention to detail that had characterized his entire relationship with death. He dismissed his remaining servants, releasing them from oaths that could no longer protect them, and secured the doors of his bedchamber with his own hands. The room that had served as a shrine to impossible love would become a funeral pyre for a romance that had defied both God and nature. The oil he poured around the chamber's perimeter came from the same vessels that had once burned in celebration of his wedding to Elitza. The same aromatic oils that had perfumed their marriage bed during nights when the future had seemed infinite and their love had appeared capable of conquering any obstacle. Now those same oils would serve as fuel for a conflagration that would reduce their earthly remains to ash and smoke, transforming their physical forms into something that could rise beyond the reach of earthly judgment. Boyan lifted Elitza's preserved body in his arms with the same tenderness he had shown on their wedding night, when she had been warm and breathing and full of laughter that had made the palace walls seem to sing with joy. Her weight had not changed significantly despite the alterations wrought by death and preservation. She remained the same slight figure who had once danced in his arms, who had whispered secrets in his ear, who had made him believe that love could triumph over any earthly concern. As he held her against his chest, he could almost convince himself that he felt the ghost of her heartbeat, the phantom warmth of breath against his neck. The torch he had prepared burned with unusual brightness, its flame fed by the same precious oils that would soon consume them both. As the Templars' axes splintered the chamber doors and their voices rose in prayers that sounded more like battle cries, Boyan pressed his lips against Elitza's cold mouth one final time, tasting the chemical sweetness of the preservatives that had maintained her earthly form for these few stolen months. Then he touched the flame to the oil-soaked floor and watched as fire bloomed around them like deadly flowers, like the roses that had once filled their garden during the brief spring of their happiness. The flames consumed the chamber with supernatural speed, as if the very air had been waiting for this moment of release. The heat rose around them in waves that distorted vision and sound, transforming the familiar room into something that existed beyond the normal boundaries of space and time. Boyan held Elitza tighter as the fire climbed the walls and spread across the ceiling, painting everything in shades of orange and gold that reminded him of sunset, of autumn leaves, of all the beautiful endings that had marked their life together. The Templars found the chamber's remains 3 days later, after the stones had cooled enough to permit entry, and the smoke had finally ceased its upward spiral toward heaven or hell. What they discovered defied both explanation and expectation. While everything else in the room had been reduced to ash and charcoal, Queen Elitza's body lay intact upon the ruins of the royal bed. Her preserved flesh unmarked by flame, her funeral garments merely singed around the edges. Her face retained the peaceful expression that had characterized her death sleep, as if the fire had parted around her like the Red Sea before Moses, as if some power beyond their understanding had chosen to protect her from the very destruction her husband had intended as their mutual salvation. The discovery sent shock waves through the assembled clerics and knights, men whose faith in the natural order had already been tested by reports of the king's blasphemous preservation of his dead wife. Some whispered of miracles, others of diabolic intervention, while the most pragmatic among them simply ordered the body removed and burned again, this time with proper Christian rites and sufficient fuel to ensure complete destruction. But before their orders could be carried out, the body vanished during the night, spirited away by unknown hands to an unknown destination, leaving behind only the outline of where it had lain, and the lingering scent of roses and myrrh. The legend of what happened next has been passed down through generations of storytellers, each adding their own embellishments to a tale that may have begun in history, but has since transcended into myth. Some claim that Elitza's body was taken by a secret cult of the king's most devoted followers, men and women who had witnessed the pure devotion of his love and could not bear to see it desecrated by those who had never known such passion. Others believe that supernatural forces intervened, that angels or demons or some other power beyond human comprehension claimed her remains for purposes that mortals could not fathom. The truth, if truth can be applied to events that exist at the intersection of history and legend, may be simpler and more profound than any of the stories that have grown around it. Perhaps Boyan's love had indeed transcended the boundaries that separate the living from the dead, creating something that existed beyond the reach of flame or time, or the judgment of men who had never risked their souls for the sake of another's touch. Perhaps his final act had not been one of destruction, but of transformation, turning their earthly love into something that could exist in the spaces between worlds, in the shadows cast by candlelight, in the dreams of those who still believed that love could conquer death itself.